Johnny Shanklin come out there and started doing this, so I'm a little behind, but it is good to see everybody out tonight. If you would be opening up your Bibles to John chapter 5, and that's where we'll be studying from this evening. We are, let me see here, pull that up and that down and that over there. John chapter 5 is where we are. Of course, we've been talking about throughout, really since the end of chapter 2, was the verse about how that Jesus didn't have to have anybody witness to Him about man because He knew the hearts of everybody. He understood what they need. We saw that with Nicodemus. We saw that with the woman at the well. We talked about last week this account of the official's son that Jesus healed. Distance wasn't a problem. He wanted him to come back with him to Capernaum, but distance wasn't a problem. Jesus says he's well, and he's well. And you're going to see again when you get to John chapter 5 now, this same idea that Jesus doesn't have to be told what anybody needs because He knows what we need, and He knows us. And of course, as we've started every class, I'll ask, what's the two verses you got to know to get John? 20, 30, and 31. Many other signs truly did Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these signs are written so that you would believe that Jesus is the Christ, and through that belief have eternal life. And so as John continues to lay out for us the case for who Jesus is, he's telling us more and more about Him with each one of these accounts. Again, we saw with the healing of the official's child that space is not a problem for Jesus. And tonight, we talked about last week how that the end of chapter 4 and chapter 5 really kind of go together. In this, another healing account, you're going to see how that time is not really an issue with Jesus either. So, beginning in John chapter 5 and verse 1, the scene is going to shift a little bit. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And we don't know, of course, because it didn't tell us exactly which feast that he's talking about here. There's some that thinks that maybe that this is the Feast of Weeks, or the Pentecost, we would call it, that would occur 7 weeks after Passover did. Some think that maybe this was another Passover feast that Jesus was at. Some thinks it was the Feast of Tabernacles, or some thinks it was that it was Hanukkah. There's lots of opinions about why, but it didn't really tell us, and I don't really think that's the point, because He has told us and will tell us at different times which particular feast that Jesus went up for. But I think particularly in the context of what's going to happen with this account, the point is not so much which feast it is that Jesus went to Jerusalem for, but rather just the fact that Jesus went to the feast. If there was a feast that required them to go to Jerusalem, then Jesus went to Jerusalem. If there was something that the law required Jesus to do, Jesus obeyed the law. That's important because as we get on down into this context, there's going to be accusations made against Jesus by the religious leaders that Jesus is not following what the law of Moses said. That is not the case. Jesus is not going to necessarily follow their traditions, but Jesus followed what the law of Moses said, and I think that's why He begins this account with this particular statement to help us see that when there's something Jesus was required to do, Jesus did it. So there's a feast, whichever feast it might have been, that required them to go to Jerusalem, so Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And it says in verse 2, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed." Now, there's a lot of controversy. Again, I know when y'all went to Jerusalem, to Israel, you went to a Bethesda. We did too. The place where this actually takes place, there's a little bit of debate about There's a place there, though, that's just right outside of where the Temple Mount is that is called Bethesda. There's a little sign on the wall that says it's Bethesda, and there's a place that they've unearthed where they think that this particular pool is. There's a really beautiful sanctuary that's been built in that place, which everywhere that they think something happened, they build a beautiful sanctuary, and it is gorgeous. And the other thing that's interesting about it is every one of those sanctuaries that they build, I don't know how they know how to do it, but the acoustics are just awesome. And so our group, when we went, we waited for everybody to kind of get out of the way up front, and we all went up there and we sang about 4 songs. And when we got done, everybody that was there in that chapel, they're sitting in pews like y'all are, and they started applauding, and we're like, that's not why we did that, you know. And but beautiful place. And if that's where it was, and it's, we'll talk about where that location is in just a minute, that helps us to understand maybe a few things about it. But there's this pool there. It's got 5 colonnades, it says, which is covered porches. And this is I'll show you here. This is kind of where they're thinking that it might be, the location that we're at now. So this is the Temple Mound that you see there on the left, and then over to the right side is Bethesda, and I'll show you a better picture of that in just a minute. And coming up from there, down that little slope there, right above where it says Pool of Israel, is where they think that the sheep gate was. And the sheep gate is where they think that they would carry the sheep in as they were bringing them in for the sacrifices that they would make, and they would slaughter the sheep very close to that gate and then bring them on in and that type of thing. And that's going to be important a little bit more here in just a minute. Here's a picture of where they've unearthed this down in that little bottom there below those archways, where they think maybe that this pool was that people were coming to. And this, one of the cool things at the museum in Jerusalem, there's this, I forget now what it is, 1/20th scale, I think, something like that, of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. And the whole thing is probably as big as this room from here to the back of the auditorium. I mean, it's massive, and you can see people, well, if I get up to it, you can see the people in the background, that there's this little walkway around it, and you can walk all around it, and everything that as I'm going through it, I'm trying to take as many pictures as I can, because I'm thinking I'm never going to see a better scale model of what Jerusalem looked like. But this is kind of the idea behind these the 5 covered porches. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 around it, and that 5th portico is the one that runs in the middle. There was an upper pool and a lower pool. And what's happened is, as he talks about here in verse 3, he says, in this lays all of these people that are coming, the poor and the blind and the lame, and all these people that are looking for some sort of way to have their ailments cured. And there's a lot of theories about why that happens. You know, it could be that there's nothing really to it. It could be that it's just they were hoping that it would happen. There may have been some people that had some, some medicinal effects with, because it may have been, like around in our parts, all the different communities like Chestnut Glades and different places that had springs in them, that years ago, people from all over what was then the United States, mostly the eastern part, would come to our part of the world just to sit where these springs were. And, whatever polio or arthritis or whatever it might have, the healing properties of being in that, it could be something like that, or it could just be that these are people that don't have anywhere else to turn. And if you've tried everything that could work, you'll try anything that might work, and maybe that's where these people are at this time. But you'll notice, if you're looking in your ESVs, you'll notice that we go from verse 3 to verse 5. And this is one of those places, and it's been a while since we've covered any of these kind of places in the text, and so some of you may have not heard this before, some of you have, but kind of a little bit of how we got the Bible stuff. Maybe you've seen the posts that are on social media and different places. Don't use this translation because they cut these verses out. Well, it's not really that they cut those verses out. It's that, over the course of time, just like some of you, George, a while ago, walked up and he had his little John book opened and where he had taken notes around the text. Well, people would do that in olden times. They would write little notes around the text, and it gets copied and whatnot and kind of inserted into the text. Well, now we have much older manuscripts that go all the way back to the 2nd century, which is, right after the completion of the Bible. We've got literally thousands and thousands and thousands of manuscripts that we can compare. And it's kind of like the telephone game. Have you ever played the telephone game before? You whisper something in somebody's ear. I whisper in Eddie's ear that we're going to go drink some coffee at Dairy Queen after services tonight. And we go all the way around the room. By the time we get to Matt Valley, then Matt Valley's saying, Corey just bought stock in a coffee company in Columbia. And it kind of, gets twisted a little. Well, that's kind of what happens with manuscripts. So the older, closer to the originals, we don't have the originals, but the closer to the originals we can get, the closer to what is accurate we feel like we can have. And I was going to show you, this is this book is one. There's lots of these kinds of books. A textual commentary on the Greek New Testament written by Bruce Metzger is the one that I use, and there's several like this where they'll go through different passages and they'll give ratings as to what they think is the likelihood. So if it gets an A rating, that's like saying, we've got enough manuscript evidence that we're sure this is the way it's supposed to be. If it's a B rating, we've got enough manuscript evidence that we're pretty sure it's the way it's supposed to be. If it's a C rating, then it's, we're kind of divided 50-50 about it should be this way or it could be this way. If it gets a D rating, that's basically saying we have no idea how it's supposed to be, But one of the things that, when you look at this particular passage, I've got it pulled up here, chapter 5 and verse 4, you can see, hopefully up there, that it's an A rating to omit that verse. Now, if you've got an English translation with verse 4 in there, what it tells you is that why these lame and sick people sat around these pools is because once a year an angel would come down and touch the water and stir it up, and the first one in got healed. Now think about that, even without knowing what Metzger said. Does that sound like the way God works? All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a lottery system. And once a year, I'm going to have an angel touch the water, and whoever is the fastest is the one that gets healed. On your mark, get set. Does that sound like the way God works? Well, of course not. And so it's not, verse 4, there's nothing wrong if your translation happens to have it in there. Just understand that this is an explanation of why they were sitting around the pool, this is what people thought was happening. Later on, when Jesus is having a conversation with this man that he's going to have a conversation with, he's going to talk about that. And so verse 4 was somebody writing a note in there that said, here's why. You wonder why all of these lame and sick and blind people are sitting around this pool? Well, this is why. It was because these are people that have no hope, and they're looking for some sort of ray of hope. And maybe the spring that was underneath it, there's a talk about how that because it's right down the hill from where the sheep gate was, how much blood would run down into these pools at times, and because of that it would change the appearance of it, and maybe that's what gave people the idea. But it's not that God works this way, it's that that's what people were thinking. They're looking for something to draw some sort of hope with. So that's what's going on in this particular verse 4. So in any effect, you've got all these blind and lame and paralyzed people that are there in this moment, and they're looking and waiting for this opportunity that they can get there. And then he says in verse 5, one man was there, and there's a bunch of these people that are there, but one man we're going to center on, who had been an invalid for 38 years. And we don't know what caused him to be an invalid. There's, again, you read commentaries, lots of speculation, partly based on what Jesus' conversation is going to have with him later, but I don't know that necessarily we can draw the line that he was an invalid because of some sinful activity, but that's what a lot of commentaries will say. Maybe he was an invalid because of some sinful activity he was involved in, but we don't know that. If you watch The Chosen, and right before I got up here, we were talking about, Webb and I, about showing The Chosen, this scene, and right before I got up here, I actually hit the wrong thing, and I knocked that off, but I'll try to pull it up if we have time at the end again. But in The Chosen, what they portray is that when he's a little boy, he climbs up a tree and falls out of the tree, and that's how he becomes lame, and maybe that's what happened, who knows. But imagine for 38 years, there's nothing. Now, in our day and time, there's lots that can be done with people who, we've got equipment and wheelchairs and vehicles and all sorts of things that can help people that are in bad situations physically like this. In that day of time, they didn't have anything. And you mainly relied on, hopefully you had some parents or some siblings or someone that would take care of you or help you along the way. And if you didn't, you were just out of luck. And a lot of these were considered, the natural assumption for people was at that time, the theology is that God always blesses the righteous and He always curses those who do wrong. So if you've been an invalid for 38 years, guess what that means? In their way of thinking, you must be really, really sinful that God did something so awful to you. You must have been really awful at some point. So they would be considered unclean, they would be considered unrighteous, they would be considered people that we're going to push to the side. But one of the cool things about Jesus is how often we see Him, the people that society pushes to the edge, the sick and the weak, and those that no one wanted anything to do with, the old and the young. Jesus noticed everybody and took time for them. So, verse 6, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, He said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" So imagine being an invalid for 38 years. You're sitting by a pool hoping that a legend is right. That's your only hope. And somebody says, "Do you want to be healed?" What would your answer be? Now be honest. We don't want to say it in the church building, but we'd say, "Well, duh." Right? What do you think, buddy? Of course I want to be healed. It's kind of like, and we do this, I do it, you do it, we all do it. You see somebody at the hospital, you go into the room, and what's the first thing we ask? "How you doing?" "Well, I'm great. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Thought I'd hang out at the hospital today," you know. It seems like such an elementary, obvious question. Do you want to be healed? But there's a greater lesson, a deeper lesson that Jesus is going to get to eventually. So one of the things that I've done in my Bible, you'll see on the screen here, is that all of these places, this question, "Do you want to be healed?" is repeated. So, or this idea of being healed. So verse 9, once the man was healed. And then verse 11, the man who healed me, he talks about. And then down in verse 14, Jesus says, "See, you are well." It's the same word. Well or healed. It's the same word that in Timothy and Titus, when Paul's talking to Timothy and Titus about sound doctrine, it's the same word. It's healthy. It's well. It's whole. Sound, we don't usually use that as a health word unless you've gone to buy a horse and you say that horse is sound. It means he's healthy or he's well. He's whole. He's like he should be. And that's what Jesus is asking this man who's paralyzed. Do you want to be well? Well, of course I want to be well. Why do you think that I'm here? So the sick man answers in verse 7, "Sir," now we notice in John chapter 4 how that progression of what the Samaritan woman at the well called Jesus. You don't see a progression per se like you do there, but notice verse 7, he calls him "Sir," Verse 11, when he's talking to other people about Jesus, he calls him the man. And then they ask, who is the man? And then later on, he knew that it was Jesus who healed him. So there's a lot of question marks right now about who Jesus is. But the point is he calls him sir because he doesn't know who Jesus is. Lots of times we'll see in the Gospels that there are people that need to be healed, and when they hear Jesus is around, they go to Him just like the official did in chapter 4. They go seeking Jesus because I want you to heal me or someone I love. Or like blind Bartimaeus is on the roadside. Who's coming? It's Jesus, and he calls out to him because I've heard about Jesus. Well, this man didn't know who Jesus was. Maybe he had heard some stories or maybe not, but he didn't recognize Jesus. He didn't ask Jesus for anything. He's just laying there minding his own business, and probably is upset that he's been disturbed by this guy that walks up and asks him what he would think is a dumb question. Do you want to be healed? Well, sure, I want to be healed. So he answers, though, and he says, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me. Again, that doesn't make any sense to us maybe because we don't know the legend of that pool, but that's what the note from verse 4 was describing. I'd like to be healed, but I don't have anybody to put me in the water. And if that anybody to put me in the water, how am I going to be healed? Now, do you see the irony here of this conversation? You've got God the Son standing right in front of you, and the only thing you can see is the water that the legend says can heal you. The only way I can be healed, he's not focused on Jesus, he's focused on that pool. The only way I can be healed is to get into that water, which we would say is water with a little w. And remember what he told the woman at the well he was? Living water with a big W. You're focused on that water that legend says maybe if you get in there first, maybe you can be healed. And you've got the living water right in front of you, and you can't see what the answer is. And don't we do that sometimes? That we're trying to figure out how to fix our lives or how to fix our marriage or how to fix our relationships or how to fix my future or how to fix whatever, and we're focused on everything except the one that can fix all of our problems. And that's Jesus. So he said, I don't have anybody to put me in the water, so I'm just out of luck. And Jesus says to him, get up, take up your bed, and walk. And I'm trying to put myself in the man's shoes, and I'm thinking, I wish it was that easy, right? I wish I could just get up and walk. In 38 years, how many times have I dreamed about being able to walk? In 38 years, how many times have I prayed about and wished about getting to walk? And this guy comes up and says, do you want to be healed? Well, of course I want to be healed, but I can't get in the water. I need somebody to carry me. And now you say something so dumb as, well, just get up and walk. Well, it's not that easy. But it says, and at once, the man was healed. And I don't know what that felt. If all of a sudden he felt it, I had a doctor's appointment the other day, found out that my sugar was high, so they're doing all of this. The intern that was there with the doctor, she has me take my socks and shoes off and lay back, and she starts poking me all up and down my legs, and I'm like, what is that for? And she said, just making sure you got blood flow. Well, you saw me walk in here, didn't you? And she says, can you feel that? Well, yeah, I can feel that. And then she takes my pulse at my ankle, and she said, well, that's good. And then my feet are like this, and she says, tell me if you can feel this. And she did that. And you don't know this about me, but you can look at my feet, and I start laughing. I'm that ticklish. And so she does that, and I came 6 foot off the table, and she started dying. She said, well, you can feel that, can't you? I said, yeah, I can feel that, you know. I don't know if it was suddenly he felt something in his foot, if he felt strength. I don't know what it felt like, but all of it once, he was healed. That's our word. He said, do you want to be healed? I'd love to be healed, but I don't have anybody to get me in the little W water. And the big W water says, well, get up. And he's healed. And he took up his bed and walked. Now think about that for a minute. How long had he been without the ability to walk? 38 years. Guess what happens if you lay in a bed? Not 38 years. Let's say 38 days. Guess what you're going to have to do? Learn to walk again. You're going to have to do therapy, right? My daddy-in-law mostly sat in a recliner while he was going through all of his cancer treatments and all. And he's, you know, just getting up out of the chair, just took it. And I'd come over there and he'd say, no, I'll get it. You know, well, now he's doing better and he's doing therapy and he can get up on his, and, you know, there's pride in the fact that I can stand up on my. Guess what happens if you lay in a bed for 3.8 years? You're definitely going to have to learn to walk. The muscles stop working, the joints quit working, you're stiff. And after 38 years, Jesus says, get up and walk, and it's just like on Here Comes Santa Claus, the Rankin Bass, you put one foot in front, and he's walking right out the door. Immediately. How does that happen? And so he took up his bed and he walked. And then the music would change if we were watching this on a movie. Now that day was the Sabbath. Dun, dun, dun. And here's where the tension is going to come in. Because there wasn't anything wrong with healing on the Sabbath. There wasn't anything wrong with what Jesus told the man to do. There wasn't anything wrong with what the man did. The Jews are going to be upset that Jesus healed him on the Sabbath, that Jesus told him to pick up his bed and walk, because they're going to say that it defies the laws of Moses. But that's not what the laws of Moses said. The Sabbath day was created for rest, and it was because of God resting on the seventh day. And they had made it to this point of, with all of their rules and regulations, it's supposed to be a day of rest, you're not supposed to work. So a logical question comes up from good and honest hearts. Well, what's work? Well, we need to define that. And the more they get to defining and commenting on it, the way weird and out there that it gets. Just like we get sometimes when we go beyond what God says, and maybe we do it with good and honest hearts and intentions, but we make it way harder to follow Jesus than He meant for it to be. And so they had all of these rules and regulations. Like, for example, you could pick up something with the back of your hand, and that's not work. But if you pick up something with your hand turned over, that's work. Now, some of you are looking at me like I've lost my mind. I didn't invent the rules. I'm just reporting them, you know. But that's literally kind of the whenever we were over there, and I've talked about this before, but you got the Shabbat elevators. On the Sabbath day, you can't push the button to go to, you know, the fourth floor or whatever, because that's work. When you push that button, there's an electric spark, so technically you've built a fire. Now, you're laughing like I'm pulling your leg, but I promise you it's the truth. So most of the hotels we stayed in were like 3 or 4 stories, and it's not that bad. But in Jerusalem, we were staying in a 13-story floor or 14-story floor, whatever it was, and we're at the next to the top, and we get in the elevator, and we get to floor 2, and the door's open, and there's nobody there. And then it closed. And then we go to floor 3, and the door's open, and there's no. And I didn't know if Elf had been in there, and he had, you know, hit all the buttons or what had happened, but they programmed the elevators so you don't. They've invented all of these rules and regulations, and it has nothing to do with what Moses said. It's their rules and regulations and their traditions. So the Jews, verse 10, and remember in John, the Jews are the antagonists. They're the ones, Jesus is a Jew and the disciples are Jews, but the Jews in John are the ones that are opposed to Jesus. The Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. And that's false. It was not against the law of Moses for him to take up his bed. It was against their traditions for him not to take up his bed. But they had elevated their traditions to the same level as God's commands. And we do that sometimes, don't we? And that's one of the things Jesus had to struggle with, was the fact that they cared more about their traditions even than what God had said, and sometimes we do the same. So they said it's not lawful, but He answered them, the man who healed me, the man that said to me, take up your bed and walk. So who told you that you could carry around your bed since it's the Sabbath? Well, the guy that healed me. And it's kind of an Adam moment. Remember when God said, who told you were naked? Well, this woman you gave me, trying to push the blame off, you know. Well, it wasn't my idea. But think about, I've been lame for 38 years. A guy tells me I can get up and walk, and I get up and walk. I'm probably going to do about whatever he asked me to do at that point, aren't you? So that's the guy that told me that. And they said, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Now, the man who'd been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. Why would there have been a crowd in the place? Well, amazement, but what did He say in verse 1? It's a festival, it's a feast. So there's all these people here, but the amazement should have made them notice something. Later on in the book of Acts, when Peter and John heal a lame man, everybody knew that he was a lame man, right? Because he'd been sitting there for a long time. And they were amazed that this lame man is jumping up and down and dancing. They've got a man who's been lame for 38 years, and they never said, you know, that's strange. I thought he was lame. They never said, how did this happen? They didn't say, what are you doing walking around? They said, who told you you could carry your bed? It's the Sabbath day. And he says, I don't know, because Jesus had withdrawn. There was a big crowd there, and he kind of weaseled into the crowd, and he's gone. He didn't know who it was. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple. Now, the beginning of verse 14 is so important. Jesus didn't just happen to run into him later. Jesus didn't just hear about what was going on with this guy. Jesus' question is, do you want to be healed? And the man said, yes, I'd love to be healed, but I don't have any way to be healed. And Jesus healed him and took care of his physical needs. But that's not the most important part of Jesus' ministry, is it? Is it? It's not the most important part of our ministry either. So Jesus finds him because I've taken care of your physical needs, but that's really not important. You could have lived 38 more years, died, sitting beside that pool, and in the grand scheme of things, 1,000 years from now, would it have mattered? Absolutely not. So Jesus found him in the temple later on and says, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. And here's the punchline. We've been talking about how all these signs have kind of a punchline. Here's the punchline, I believe, of this sign. You are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse happens to you. Well, what could be worse than being physically lame, physically sick for 38 years? What could be worse? Lose your soul. To be spiritually sick. Do we see that? I'm not in any way, understand what I'm saying. I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't pray for those who are physically sick. We ought to. We have Bible commands to do so. But you think about how much of our prayers as a congregation and individually, how much of our prayer life is spent about physical things and how much about spiritual things? How often do we pray for the spiritually sick like we do the physically sick? Now, Bryce is leading our closing prayer in just a moment, so a lot of pressure has been put on Bryce right now, you know. But how much do we pray about the spiritually sick? You know, tonight, if Gannon, we couldn't find Gannon, we looked all over and couldn't find him, and we went to the elders and said, we can't find Gannon, guess what they would do? If any child in our family here that's here tonight, if any child was missing and you found out about that, what would we do as a congregation? Yeah. We wouldn't just get in our car and say, well, hopefully they'll find him, you know. The elders would get on the microphone and they make it, Corey Melody can't find Gannon. Let's all look for him. And we'd scour the place looking for him. We'd go around the neighborhood. We might even do an Amber Alert, you know. What if somebody's lost spiritually? Do we do a spiritual Amber Alert? If you found out tonight, if I wasn't here, and you found out tonight that Corey's not here, Danny's filling in for me, Corey's not here tonight because he just found out today that he's got terminal cancer and he's only got weeks to live. I don't know. I do know because I know y'all. I can't imagine how many of you be at my house tonight after services are over. Do we show that same kind of concern for someone who's spiritually sick? You see what I'm saying? There's a bigger issue here that Jesus is trying to get to. By the way, this is the comment that he makes that makes some people think that maybe he was an invalid because he had done some sinful activity. But Jesus doesn't really say that. What he says is that if you sin, there's something worse that can happen to you than being lame for 38 years. And that's losing your soul, as Danny said. So the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Now, when the Jews were asking him, the religious leaders were asking him, who told you to pick up your bed? Who healed you? Don't you know they were probably thinking, I bet it's Jesus. They're already after him, trying to find something on him. And then he comes back and says, oh, it was Jesus. And now they're seeking to kill him because we got to get rid of this guy who's not following our traditions. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. My Father's working, and I'm working. My Father's working on the Sabbath. They had made the Sabbath day you couldn't do anything on. Did God not do anything on the seventh day? If you go back to Genesis 2, it says that He rested from His creative work. He rested from the creating that He had done. God works every day. How long do you think? God is the sustainer. Jesus is the sustainer of everything. How long would this world, this universe last if God said, I'm going to take a day off? Not very long, right? Jesus says, my Father is working today on the Sabbath, and we've tried to take some of those Sabbath rules and apply them to Sunday, and we shouldn't work on Sunday, and I've had conversations with people, and they say, well, nobody should work on Sunday, and I say, what about the preacher? And they say, oh, he needs to work, and I'm like, wait a minute. You know, when I went to Eastwood and was the preacher there, when I accepted the job, one of the things they asked me to do is they want to know what 2 days of the week I wanted to be my days off. They said, because we're not counting Sunday as a day off. We know Sunday is a work day for you, and it's probably your hardest day. And so I told them the 2 days I wanted to be off was Sunday and Wednesday, and they didn't like that, you know. So I had to pick 2 other days. But this idea of working, God's working. The Father's working, and Jesus says, and I am too. So guess what He's doing here? He's making Himself equal with God. And they're going to have a problem with that in the next verse, and we'll talk about this more next week. They were seeking all the more to kill Him because not only was He breaking the Sabbath, but He's even calling God His Father, making Himself equal with God. Are you trying to make yourself equal with God? Jesus would say, yep. Remember how John began this gospel? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So He's God. Now, do you want to be well? That's the question that Jesus asked this man. That's the question that John puts in his gospel for us as his readers to consider and think about. Do you want to be well? Do you want to have a better outlook, a better attitude, a better future? Do you want to be well? Then you have to go to Jesus. Do you want a better marriage, a better relationship with your kids, a better relationship with your parents? then Jesus is the answer. Do you want to be well? Do you want to have a better relationship with your neighbors and your coworkers, and your boss and your employees? Do you want to have a better outlook when you get a diagnosis, or you have financial trouble, or you have hurts, or you have disappointments, or you're discouraged? Do you want to be well? Well, the living water is the one that can cure what really ails us, because everyone in this room is sick. Not with COVID or the flu or the stomach virus or being lame for 38 years, but we're sick with the problems that we have in our lives. We're sick with sin. We're sick with the things of this life that hinder us and pull us down. So do you want to be well? Well, then Jesus is the answer. And we can either challenge that and go against that, or we can accept that and understand that at that point, it doesn't really matter what happens to us in this life, because Jesus